Hey guys, tonight we're looking at something so ordinary that it almost disappears from history. Sleeping on straw. But for millions of people, across centuries, this simple bed was not a rustic comfort or a charming farmhouse detail. It was a nightly compromise with cold, damp, insects, smells, aching bones, and the quiet reality that rest itself was shaped by poverty, labor, season, and social rank. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support this kind of work. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history videos, you're very welcome to subscribe. Now, let's step into a house where the day is over, the fire is fading, and the bed is not a mattress as we understand it, but a sack of straw waiting in the dark. For much of European history, especially among rural laborers, servants, tenant farmers, and the poor in towns, sleep was not separated from the rest of life in the way modern people often imagine. There was no private bedroom with a clean mattress, no reliable warmth, no soft barrier between the body and the floor, and often no clear boundary between people, animals, tools, stored food, smoke, mud, and bedding. A place to sleep was simply one more part of the household economy. It had to be made from what was available, repaired when possible, tolerated when necessary, and shared more often than modern comfort would allow. Straw became one of the most common answers because it was practical. It came from the stalks left after grain had been harvested and threshed. Wheat, rye, oats, or barley could provide material that was cheap, dry enough when stored properly, and springy compared with bare boards or packed earth. To a household with little money, straw had one important virtue. It was not precious in the same way as wool, linen, feathers, or horsehair. It was agricultural residue, a byproduct of survival. Yet that is also the key to understanding it. People did not sleep on straw because it was romantic. They slept on straw because it was there. The basic form of the straw bed was often a sack or ticking filled with straw and laid on a wooden frame, a bench-like platform, a rope bed, or sometimes directly on the floor. The ticking might be made of rough linen, canvas, or another sturdy fabric, depending on what the household could afford. When fresh, the straw could seem almost pleasant. It gave off a dry, grassy smell. It lifted the sleeper slightly above the cold surface beneath, could be fluffed, turned, beaten, and shaped. For a tired body after a day of fieldwork, hauling water, tending animals, kneading bread, chopping wood, or carrying loads, even a rough straw mattress could feel like relief. But that relief had a short life. Straw flattened. The stems cracked under repeated weight. The mattress that first seemed full and springy could become lumpy, uneven, and sharp in places. Broken stalks poked through cloth. Dust gathered inside. Moisture entered from the air, from damp clothing, from muddy feet, from breath, from spilled drink, from leaks in the roof, and sometimes from the floor itself. In a world where houses were often poorly sealed, where rain could drive through thatch or gaps, and where winter dampness settled into walls and bedding, straw was never just bedding. It was a material constantly negotiating with the environment. This is where modern imagination often softens the past too much. We picture straw as dry, golden, clean, almost theatrical. But the straw of an ordinary bed was not a decorative bundle in a museum display. It was handled, slept on, sweated into, compressed by bodies, disturbed by children, and affected by smoke, fleas, lice, mice, dust, and mildew. A household might change it when they could, especially when new straw became available after harvest. But when they could mattered. Fresh bedding required access, time, labor, and sometimes permission. Servants might have little control over the bedding they used. Poor families might stretch old straw longer than was comfortable. In years of scarcity, even straw had uses beyond sleep. And this is one of the quiet contradictions of straw bedding. It was cheap, but it was not always disposable in practice. In a comfortable household, foul or flattened straw might be replaced with relative ease. In a poorer one, the same bedding might be patched, shaken out, aired, turned, or tolerated because everything had a cost. Even waste had value. Straw could be used for animals, packing, roofing, fuel, floor covering, or compost. To throw it away too freely could feel wasteful in a world where every material had a possible second life. At night, the first sensation would have been physical. The body met the bed with a kind of guarded acceptance. The sleeper might know exactly where the worst lumps were. They might turn the mattress, knead it with their hands, or push straw away from a sharp ridge. A person sleeping alone could search for a tolerable hollow. A person sleeping beside others had less freedom. Many slept in shared beds. Spouses, siblings, servants, apprentices, travelers in inns, or laborers lodged together. The bed was not only a place of rest. It was a crowded piece of furniture in a crowded society. Warmth was another reason people endured what seems uncomfortable to us. In a cold room, especially in Northern Europe or during long winter nights, sharing a bed could be practical. Bodies generated heat. Heavy blankets, if available, were valuable. A straw mattress beneath helped create distance from the cold floor and trap some air. Even a poor bed could be better than no bed. This is important because history becomes more honest when we remember that discomfort is relative. A straw bed full of problems might still be a cherished improvement over sleeping on bare rushes, a bench, a cloak, or the packed earth near a dying fire. The house itself shaped the experience. In many modest homes, the sleeping area was near the hearth, not because it was cozy in the modern sense, but because the hearth was the center of warmth, light, cooking, and survival. Smoke might linger in rafters. Ash could drift. The smell of animals might enter from nearby stalls or yards. In some rural households, livestock were close enough that the sounds of breathing, shifting hooves, and restless movement formed part of the night's soundscape. The bed was not sealed away from work. It sat inside a world that never fully stopped being practical. By the time a family lay down, the straw had already absorbed the day's atmosphere. If the room was smoky, the bedding smelled of smoke. If the season was damp, the bedding might feel faintly clammy. If fleas had found the household, the straw offered shelter. If mice entered the walls or stored grain, they might investigate bedding as well. And if the sleeper had spent the day in the fields, byres, kitchens, roads, or workshops, the bed received the trace of that labor. Clothing was not always changed completely for sleep. Washing was limited. Feet could be dirty. Hair could carry dust. The bed gathered the household's ordinary life. This does not mean people were careless. That is a modern misunderstanding. Many historical households worked constantly to maintain order under difficult conditions. Bedding could be aired outdoors when weather allowed. Straw could be shaken, turned, or replaced. Sheets, where available, could be washed, though laundry itself was heavy labor. Herbs such as lavender, tansy, rosemary, or fleabane were sometimes used in domestic spaces, partly for scent and partly in the hope of discouraging pests. Floors might be swept. Mattresses might be beaten. The problem was not that people enjoyed filth. The problem was that cleanliness had to fight materials, architecture, climate, insects, labor shortages, and poverty all at once. The insects deserve a quiet place in the story because they changed sleep from rest into endurance. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other biting pests were familiar enemies in many periods. Straw did not create all of them, but it could shelter them. A mattress filled with organic material, used repeatedly, warmed by bodies, and difficult to clean thoroughly was an inviting environment. A person could go to bed exhausted and still spend part of the night scratching, shifting, slapping at skin, or trying to find a cooler patch. The cruelty of this was not dramatic. It was repetitive. Night after night, the body sought rest, and the bed answered imperfectly. There is a deeper social meaning here too. The quality of a bed quietly revealed rank. The wealthy might sleep on featherbeds, layered mattresses, fine sheets, bolsters, curtains, and carved bed frames. Even their beds had problems, including pests and damp, but they had more ways to soften them. The poor had fewer layers between body and world. Straw bedding made inequality intimate. It was not only seen in clothing, food, land, or taxes. It was felt in the shoulders, hips, spine, and skin after hours of trying to sleep on something that had already lost its shape. Yet the line between comfort and discomfort was not always as simple as straw for the poor and feathers for the rich. Many middling households used mixed arrangements. A bed might have a straw mattress below and a softer layer above. A feather bed might rest on a straw-filled base. Servants in a wealthy household might sleep on straw while their masters slept in softness nearby. Inns might provide bedding of varying quality depending on what a traveler could pay. In hospitals, barracks, monasteries, ships, and workhouses, straw might appear as a practical bulk material, easy to fill and replace in theory, though not always replaced as often as sleepers wished. This is one reason straw bedding lasted so long. It was flexible. It could serve the poor as a main bed, the middling as a support layer, institutions as cheap mass bedding, and travelers as temporary rest. It belonged to a world where materials moved from field to house and back again. The grain harvest fed people. The leftover stalks roofed buildings, lined stalls, packed goods, covered floors, and filled mattresses. A single crop could become food, shelter, bedding, and waste returned to soil. From a modern point of view, that may sound efficient. From the sleeper's point of view, it could also mean spending the night on the rough edge of agricultural necessity. The yearly rhythm mattered. After harvest, fresh straw could improve the bed. The smell might be cleaner, the loft higher, the surface more forgiving. There may have been a small domestic satisfaction in stripping out the old, stale filling and replacing it with something new. But as weeks passed, the bed changed. Damp weather made it heavier. Repeated sleep pressed it flat. Children jumping, adults turning, and shared bodies compressed the stuffing. What began as a seasonal renewal became a slow decline. By late winter or early spring, when supplies were low and houses were cold, the bed could feel like another thing waiting for the year to turn. And winter was perhaps when straw bedding revealed its harshest logic. Cold intensified every weakness. A flattened mattress gave less insulation. Damp straw held chill. Getting into bed might mean waiting for body heat to create a small pocket of warmth. If blankets were thin, the sleeper curled tightly. If several people shared the bed, closeness could be both comfort and annoyance. Breath condensed in cold rooms. Fires died down because fuel had to be saved. The night stretched long, and the bed became a narrow island of tolerable warmth in a house that did not belong fully to comfort. But summer had its own problems. Warmth could draw out smells. Pests could multiply. Straw dust could irritate the nose and throat. In hot weather, shared beds could become stifling. A sleeper might push away covers, turn repeatedly, or move closer to a door or window if safety and custom allowed. The same material that helped insulate against winter cold could feel scratchy and close in summer heat. Historical discomfort was rarely one thing. It changed with the season, and people learned to adjust their expectations rather than expect the bed to solve the problem. The sounds of a straw bed were part of its presence. It rustled when someone shifted, crackled faintly under weight. In a shared room, Every movement could announce itself. A person trying not to wake others might still betray a turn of the shoulder. A child might hear the adults shifting. A servant might hear the household breathing in darkness. The bed was not silent furniture. It was a living material, dry stems moving inside cloth, reminding the sleeper that rest was built from the remains of the field. For the modern listener, perhaps the strangest part is not that people slept this way. It is that many people slept this way without expecting anything fundamentally better. Comfort as a right, or even as a normal private standard, is a fairly modern assumption. Earlier societies certainly understood luxury and softness. They desired warmth, clean linen, thick blankets, and relief from pests. But the baseline was different. A bed did not have to be perfect to be valuable. It had to keep the body off the floor, conserve some warmth, and offer enough rest for tomorrow's work. That tomorrow mattered. The true test of the straw bed came not only during the night but in the morning. A laborer rising before dawn did not have the luxury of lingering over poor sleep. Stiffness was folded into the day. It entered the back while bending over fields, the arms while carrying loads, the knees while kneeling, the hands while milking, digging, grinding, washing, or mending. Sleep was supposed to restore the body, but for many, it only repaired enough damage to make more labor possible. The bed did not erase hardship. It briefly interrupted it. Still, we should be careful not to flatten the past into misery. People made attachments to their homes, their routines, and even their imperfect beds. A familiar straw mattress, however rough, could mean safety compared with travel, war, displacement, or sleeping outdoors. The smell of fresh straw might signal harvest, order, renewal, and domestic care. A mother might tuck children under whatever coverings the household possessed. A tired couple might whisper quietly in the dark. A servant might be grateful for any assigned space after a long day. Human beings have always made meaning inside limits. That is the balance this history asks us to keep. Straw bedding was not a quaint symbol of simple living, and it was not only a horror of the past. It was a practical answer to material reality. It offered warmth and height, but also dust and insects. It was renewable, but it decayed. It was humble, but it could still be cherished when alternatives were worse. It reminds us that daily life in history was shaped less by grand events than by repeated contact with ordinary materials. Wood, wool, smoke, water, iron, clay, linen, straw. And once we understand the bed itself, a wider world begins to come into view. Because the story of sleeping on straw is also the story of houses that breathed in the weather, of harvests that entered the bedroom, of social rank felt in the bones, of women's labor in maintaining bedding, of servants sleeping in corners, of children crowded together for warmth, and of the long struggle to separate the sleeping body from dirt, cold, animals, insects, and work. By the late evening, when the candle was pinched out or the rushlight burned low, the sleeper did not enter silence as much as a different kind of noise. The fire settled. The straw shifted. Someone coughed. A board creaked. Outside, wind pressed against thatch or shutters. Inside, the bed received the weight of another night, and beneath that simple sound of rustling stalks was a whole history of labor, poverty, adaptation, and the human need to rest even when rest was never fully comfortable. And to understand what that night truly felt like, we have to look next at the room around the bed. The smoke-darkened walls, the floor beneath it, the bodies beside it, and the small domestic battles that decided whether sleep would come gently or only after hours of waiting in the dark. The room around the bed mattered because the straw was never experienced alone. It belonged to a whole interior world, one that modern people would probably notice first by smell, then by darkness, and only after that by shape. In many ordinary homes, especially before the widespread improvements of later centuries, the sleeping space was not a clean, separate chamber designed for rest. It was often a corner of a multipurpose room, a loft reached by ladder, a low bedstead near the wall, a pallet beside the hearth, or a shared space where the boundaries between cooking, storage, work, and sleep were thin. The straw bed absorbed all of that. It carried the memory of the room into the body. If the floor was packed earth, it could hold dampness from the ground beneath. If it was made of boards, the cracks might admit drafts, dust, insects, and the small sounds of rodents moving unseen. Rushes, reeds, or straw might be scattered over floors in some households, partly to soak up dirt and partly to soften the surface underfoot. But floor coverings could also gather refuse if not changed often. This meant that even before a person lay down, the bed was already surrounded by an environment that was difficult to keep truly clean. The mattress might lift the sleeper away from the worst of the floor, but it could not separate them from the room's climate. Smoke was one of the most constant companions of old domestic life. In houses with open hearths, imperfect chimneys, or poorly drawing flues, smoke did not always travel neatly upward and away. It lingered under rafters, darkened beams, irritated eyes, and settled into fabric. The straw mattress, wrapped in rough ticking or laid beneath blankets, could take on a smoky smell that became so ordinary to the household that it may hardly have been noticed. To a visitor from a cleaner, later interior, the air might feel heavy. To the people who lived there, it was simply part of the house. There is something important in that difference of perception. We often imagine the past from the outside, as if people were constantly shocked by the conditions around them. But most people are shaped by the conditions they know. A child raised in a smoky, crowded, straw-bedded room did not compare it to a modern bedroom with filtered air, a sealed window, a sprung mattress, and fresh sheets. They compared it to the barn, the floor, the road, the cold outside, or the bed of someone poorer. Comfort was measured by the options available, not by the options history had not yet created. In the evening, light changed the room. Candles were expensive for many households, and even simple rushlights had to be made, maintained, and used carefully. Darkness arrived not as a decorative mood, but as an economic fact. The less light there was, the more familiar the room had to be. People knew where the bed stood, where the stool waited, where the hearthstones lay, where a hanging garment might brush the face. The straw mattress would rustle as someone lowered themselves onto it, and the darkness would make touch more important than sight. The feel of the blanket edge, the dip in the bedding, the roughness of the linen, the warmth left by another body. A straw bed in a crowded household was rarely a private island. In a single room or in a chamber shared by several people, sleep became a social arrangement. Parents might sleep close to young children. Older children might sleep together. Servants could be placed in less comfortable areas, sometimes in attics, kitchens, halls, or near the work they were expected to rise and perform. Apprentices in town households might sleep in shop spaces or garrets. In rural cottages, the arrangement depended on what the family owned and how the building was laid out. Privacy was limited, and the bed was often part of a hierarchy of age, gender, rank, and duty. This is one of the harder adjustments for the modern mind. We tend to associate sleep with personal space. Earlier households often treated sleep as something that happened wherever the household could fit it. A bed might be shared not because it was emotionally intimate, but because space, warmth, and bedding were limited. The poorest did not always have the luxury of choosing who heard them breathe, cough, turn, scratch, or wake. A straw mattress could hold more than one body because it had to. The discomfort of one person became part of the discomfort of another. And yet, shared sleep had practical intelligence behind it. In a cold room, several bodies under limited coverings preserved warmth more efficiently than one. Children might survive winter nights more safely beside siblings or parents. Servants sleeping near kitchens or hearths might benefit from residual heat, even if they also endured smoke, hard surfaces, and early rising. A crowded bed could be irritating, but a solitary bed in a freezing room might be worse. Again and again, the past asks us not to ask whether something was comfortable by our standards, but what problem it solved for people who had fewer choices. The bedstead itself, if there was one, shaped the night. Some straw mattresses rested on ropes stretched across a wooden frame. These ropes could sag, loosen, and require tightening. A bed that needed tightening was not a metaphor but a physical reality. The support beneath the mattress determined whether the body lay level or sank into a hollow. If the ropes slackened, the sleeper might roll toward the middle. If boards supported the mattress, they might be uneven or hard beneath flattened straw. If the straw pallet lay on the floor, damp and cold were closer. Every layer mattered because there were so few layers to spare. The phrase "sleep tight," often popularly linked to rope beds, is surrounded by more modern storytelling than firm certainty. But the physical problem itself was real enough. Bedding systems had to be maintained. A bed was not a static object bought once and forgotten. It was a small piece of household technology. Rope, wood, straw, ticking, sheets, blankets, and curtains all required care when available. When any one part failed, the body felt it. The poor often lived with the failure longer. Curtains, where they existed, could make a bed feel more enclosed and warmer. In wealthier households, bed curtains helped retain heat and offered privacy. But for poorer sleepers on straw, such enclosure was often absent or crude. A curtain required cloth, and cloth was labor. Cloth meant spinning, weaving, purchasing, washing, repairing, and protecting from damp and pests. A household with little fabric could not easily spend it on visual privacy. So the person on the straw mattress might lie exposed to the room's movement, noises, and cold air. The walls around them also participated in sleep. Stone walls could radiate cold. Timber walls could admit drafts. Wattle and daub might crack. Thatched roofs could shelter well when maintained, but they also needed constant care. A leak above a bed was not a minor inconvenience. It threatened the straw itself. Damp straw could sour, mold, clump, and lose its insulating quality. In a wet season, keeping bedding dry was a domestic achievement. Airing a mattress required dry weather and space. Replacing the straw required supply. The struggle against dampness was one of the quiet battles of pre-modern sleep. Damp was more than discomfort. It affected health, mood, smell, and labor. A person who slept in damp bedding might wake chilled and stiff. They might begin the day already burdened by the room they had slept in. Modern heating hides how much daily life once depended on the weather outside and the building's ability to resist it. The straw mattress stood at the point where agriculture, architecture, and climate touched the sleeping body. Harvest quality, roof repair, household income, and winter rain could all end up under someone's back at night. There were also small domestic rituals that helped. Bedding might be lifted, turned, shaken, or propped near a fire if there was room and if the household could risk the danger of sparks. Blankets might be dried when possible. A mattress might be dragged outside on a fine day. Children could be sent to help beat bedding or gather fresh material. Women's work, especially, often carried the burden of making rough domestic life bearable. The comfort of a straw bed was rarely just the straw. It was the result of invisible maintenance. Patching ticking, washing linen, managing pests, storing dry straw, airing blankets, and deciding when something had become too foul to ignore. This labor is easy to miss because it leaves fewer dramatic records than wars, laws, or kings. But it determined whether a household slept tolerably. A woman in a rural home might have had to think about bedding while also brewing, baking, spinning, tending children, feeding animals, cleaning vessels, managing food stores, and helping in seasonal labor. In towns, servants and poorer women performed much of this work for others. Cleanliness, when achieved, was not a simple preference. It was hours of physical effort. A freshened straw bed represented time spent, weather cooperating, and materials secured. The pests returned despite these efforts. Fleas could live on animals and pass into human spaces. Lice belonged more closely to bodies and clothing. Bedbugs, where present, could hide in cracks of wood, walls, and bedding. Mice and rats were drawn to grain stores and household scraps. A straw mattress, especially old or poorly maintained, was vulnerable not because people did nothing, but because the entire domestic environment invited life in many forms. Houses were porous. Food was stored nearby. Animals were close. Warmth was scarce and therefore shared by every creature that could reach it. Imagine, for a moment, the sleeper lying still after the room has quieted. They are tired enough to sleep, but the bed has its own interruptions. A faint tickle at the ankle, a sharp bit of straw pressing into the hip, someone else turning beside them, a child murmuring, the smell of smoke, wool, bodies, and old straw, the cold edge of the blanket where it has slipped away. Perhaps the first hour passes not in rest but in adjustment, the body making small bargains with the materials beneath it. And then, eventually, exhaustion wins. That kind of sleep was not necessarily peaceful, but it could be deep. Physical labor creates a kind of tiredness that can overpower discomfort. Many people who slept on straw were not lying awake with modern insomnia, reflecting endlessly on their bedding. They were worn down by work. Their bodies took sleep where it came. The strange truth is that a rough bed may have supported very deep sleep simply because life before bed had been so demanding. But that does not make the bed comfortable. It means the body had fewer opportunities to refuse it. The timing of sleep was different too. In many periods before reliable artificial lighting, night did not always mean one continuous block of sleep exactly like the modern ideal. Historians have discussed patterns of segmented sleep, where people might sleep for a first period, wake for a time, and then sleep again, especially in long winter nights. Not everyone everywhere followed the same pattern, and we should avoid making it too simple. But in a world of long dark evenings, shared rooms, uncertain warmth, and practical household tasks, waking in the night was not always treated as a disaster. Could be ordinary. For the person on a straw bed, a nighttime waking might bring a different awareness of the room. The fire lower than before, the air colder, the straw compressed under the body, a whisper nearby, a step taken carefully over sleeping forms, someone tending a child, checking an animal, adding fuel if fuel could be spared, or simply lying still and waiting for warmth to return. The bed was part of an overnight economy. It held the body while the household passed through darkness in stages. This matters because modern sleep advice often imagines the bed as a controlled environment. Quiet, dark, cool, clean, private. Historical straw bedding existed in almost the opposite world. Noisy in small ways, smoky, variable in temperature, difficult to clean, often shared, and closely tied to labor. People still slept. They still dreamed. They still recovered enough to rise. But their sleep was embedded in a household system rather than protected from it. The morning revealed everything the night had hidden. As light entered through shutters, cracks, horn panes, oiled cloth, or an open doorway, the bed became visible again. The straw might be flattened into the shape of bodies. Blankets might be twisted. The ticking might show stains or patched seams. Dust could rise when someone slapped or shook the mattress. A person might sit up slowly, feeling the body report where the bed had failed. A stiff neck, a sore shoulder, a hip pressed too long against a hard ridge, skin irritated by bites. Then the day began not with leisure, but with immediate necessity. For servants, the transition from straw bed to labor could be especially abrupt. A kitchen maid, stable boy, dairy worker, or apprentice might sleep near the place where work resumed before sunrise. The bed was not a sanctuary from service. It was a pause inside service. In large households, the hierarchy of beds could mirror the hierarchy of the institution. Masters in chambers, upper servants in better rooms, lower servants in rougher quarters, temporary workers on pallets or straw sacks. To sleep on straw night after night was not only a material condition. It was a reminder of one's place. In inns and lodging houses, straw bedding carried another set of risks. Travelers often brought dirt, lice, fleas, illness, and exhaustion with them. Bedding used by strangers was difficult to trust. A low-cost lodging might provide a shared bed or a pallet filled with straw that had served many bodies before. The traveler might be grateful to be indoors and still uneasy about what the bed contained. In such places, the straw mattress became part of the wider movement of people. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, laborers, messengers, beggars, sailors, and migrants all carrying traces of the road into the room. Soldiers knew straw in another way. Campaigns, barracks, and temporary quarters often used straw for bedding because it could be gathered, spread, stuffed, and abandoned. In military life, straw was practical and disposable, though rarely luxurious. A soldier might sleep on straw in a stable, barn, hut, or crowded barrack, fully aware that tomorrow the bedding might be filthy, stolen, soaked, or gone. During war, the difference between a straw bed under cover and the bare ground outdoors could be enormous. Yet military straw could also carry disease, lice, and the smell of too many men in too little space. Hospitals and charitable institutions also used straw because it was economical. In theory, straw could be changed to improve cleanliness. In practice, institutional budgets, crowding, and labor determined what happened. The same material that seemed convenient for mass bedding could become dangerous when neglected. This is one of the recurring reversals in the history of straw. The very quality that made it useful, its cheapness and availability, also made it easy for those in power to offer only the minimum. A straw bed could be an act of provision, or a sign that no one intended to provide more. Even in religious settings, straw had layered meaning. Monastic simplicity, penitential practice, and ideals of humility sometimes valued hard or plain sleeping arrangements. But voluntary austerity was different from poverty without choice. A monk sleeping simply as part of discipline did not occupy the same social reality as a laborer who slept on straw because no better bedding was possible. Both might feel the roughness, but the meaning of roughness changed with agency. History becomes clearer when we notice not only what people used, but whether they had the power to choose it. Children experienced straw bedding through habit before judgment. A child born into a poor household might learn the sounds and smells of the bed as part of home itself. They might associate fresh straw with harvest time, warmth with siblings, fear with darkness, scratching with summer, and cold with mornings when frost touched the inside of the room. Childhood sleep on straw could be uncomfortable, but also familiar. The past was not lived as a series of historical conditions. It was lived as the texture of ordinary memory. For the elderly or infirm, however, straw could be much harsher. A young laborer's body might endure a lumpy mattress with less complaint. An older body, thin from age or illness, could suffer more from pressure, cold, and damp. A person confined to bed placed greater demands on bedding that was never designed for long immobility. Straw flattened faster, absorbed more, and required more frequent changing. Caregivers had to manage not only the person but the material beneath them. Here the bed's poverty became more severe, because discomfort was no longer interrupted by daytime movement. It stayed with the body hour after hour. This is another reason the history of bedding is really a history of vulnerability. The stronger, younger, and more exhausted could sometimes overpower the bed's defects. The sick, old, pregnant, injured, or very young could not. A mattress that seemed merely rough to one person could be punishing to another. The same household object changed meaning depending on the body lying on it. Social imagination also played a role. To sleep on straw could be a marker of humility, poverty, rural simplicity, institutional neglect, military hardship, or moral discipline depending on context. Literature and folklore sometimes used straw beds to signal low status or honest rustic life. Religious stories could associate straw with meekness or sacrifice. Later nostalgia would transform straw into something picturesque. The cozy barn, the simple cottage, the golden bed of an older world. But lived reality was more complicated. Straw could be soft for a few nights, tolerable for many, and miserable when old, damp, or infested. The household's animals were never far from this story. Horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, and dogs all interacted with straw in different ways. Straw-lined stalls absorbed waste, cushioned animals, and formed part of the agricultural cycle. In some buildings, human and animal spaces were separated but close. In others, especially poorer or older arrangements, the proximity could be striking. The smell of animal bedding might mingle with human bedding. Fresh straw might be divided between stable and bed. In a hard year, the needs of livestock and people competed. Keeping animals alive could be as important as human comfort, because animals represented food, labor, transport, rent, or survival. This closeness challenges a modern assumption about domestic life. We often separate the house from the farm, the bedroom from the barn, the clean from the dirty. Earlier life often placed these categories beside one another because survival required it. Straw moved between them. It was not symbolic. It was practical. The same field that produced bread also produced bedding for humans and animals. The sleeper on straw was connected, materially and immediately, to the harvest. Harvest itself determined quality. Good straw had to be dry and stored properly. If rain damaged the crop, if storage was poor, if rodents entered the stack, if mold developed, bedding suffered. The best straw for bedding was not necessarily the same as whatever remained after all other uses. Households made choices. Long, clean stems were better than broken, dusty material. But poorer families often accepted what they could obtain. A fresh straw mattress in one house might be crisp and sweet-smelling. In another, it might already carry damp, dirt, or chaff. The word chaff points to another overlooked discomfort. Grain processing left dust and small fragments that could cling to straw. A badly prepared filling might irritate skin or lungs. The mattress was not a sealed modern product. It was a sack filled by hand, often with variable material. If the ticking was loose woven or worn thin, small particles could escape. The sleeper might wake with dust in the nose, bits of straw in clothing, or a prickling sensation wherever the fabric failed. A better-made mattress reduced this. A poor one made the body aware of every shortcut. Repair was constant. A tear in the ticking mattered because straw escaped. A seam could weaken. Mice could gnaw. Children could pull at the edges. The fabric that contained the straw was as important as the straw itself, and fabric was expensive enough to be patched repeatedly. The bed might show layers of mending, each patch a small record of use. To modern eyes, patching may look quaint. To the household, it was economy. Patched mattress was not a design choice. It was survival by stitching. And when straw was changed, the old filling did not simply disappear. It might be taken out, carried away, added to manure, used for animals if still serviceable, or burned if too foul and if burning was practical. The process would release dust and smell. The empty ticking might be shaken, beaten, possibly washed, dried, and refilled. This was heavy, unpleasant work, especially in cold or damp weather. A fresh bed required disturbance before it brought relief. The room had to be unsettled so that sleep could become slightly more bearable. The emotional effect of a fresh straw bed should not be underestimated. For people living close to scarcity, small improvements mattered deeply. New straw could lift the body higher, smell cleaner, reduce some pests for a time, and restore the sense that the household was being cared for. It might not last long, but it changed the night. It made the familiar bed feel renewed. That moment of improvement helps us avoid imagining historical people only as sufferers. They noticed relief. They appreciated small comforts. They worked to create them. Still, the improvement always moved toward decline. That slow decline is central to the experience of sleeping on straw night after night. Unlike a modern mattress that may remain relatively stable for years, a straw mattress changed visibly and physically over weeks and months. It settled. It hardened. It shifted into ridges. It trapped evidence of the household. The sleeper knew the bed as something aging beneath them. Rest was not supported by a stable product, but by a perishable filling that had to be renewed again and again. This made sleep part of the agricultural calendar. Harvest brought the possibility of fresh bedding. Winter tested it. Spring exposed what had become stale. Summer brought heat and insects. The year moved through the mattress. A person did not need a calendar on the wall to know the season. The bed told them. The smell, the loft, the dampness, the pests, the cold rising from below, and the quality of available straw all mark time. From here, the story begins to widen beyond the cottage and into the changing world that slowly altered what people expected from a bed. As trade expanded, towns grew, textiles became more available, domestic standards shifted, and ideas about cleanliness, privacy, health, and comfort changed. Straw did not vanish all at once. It remained stubbornly useful, but it increasingly shared the room with other materials, other ambitions, and other promises of sleep. The old straw mattress, still rustling under tired bodies, stood at the edge of a long transformation in how people imagined the night itself. That transformation did not begin with a single invention or a sudden rejection of straw, but with a slow change in what different households believed a proper bed should do. For a long time, the bed's first duty had been simple: lift the body from the floor, conserve warmth, and make exhaustion survivable. But as towns became larger, trade networks carried more goods, and certain forms of cloth, ticking, feathers, wool, and later manufactured bedding became more available to those who could afford them. The bed began to gather new meanings. It was still a place to sleep, but it was also becoming a sign of order, decency, health, privacy, and status. For the poorer sleeper, this shift could be uncomfortable in another way. It meant that the same straw bed which had once seemed ordinary could gradually become evidence of being left behind. A rural family might still sleep on straw because the field provided it, because money was scarce, and because the household had always done so. But elsewhere, especially in towns and among more prosperous families, the expectations around bedding were quietly rising. More layers, cleaner sheets, better-filled mattresses, separate sleeping spaces, and more regular laundering became markers of improvement. Straw did not disappear. It became more socially visible. This is one of the subtle pressures of domestic history. People do not only experience comfort physically, they experience it socially. A bed that once felt normal can begin to feel poor when neighbors, employers, landlords, reformers, or visitors imagine something better. In that sense, the straw mattress was not merely under the body. It was under judgment. Its rustle could mean rural practicality in one house, servant hardship in another, institutional neglect in another, and embarrassing poverty in yet another. In many homes, improvement came in layers rather than replacements. A straw mattress might remain at the bottom, supporting a softer layer above. Wool flock, feathers, chaff, moss, Hay, or other fillings could be used depending on region and means. Some materials were warmer, some softer, some more expensive, some easier to clean, some more attractive to pests. A feather bed could be prized, but feathers required birds, labor, collection, and careful maintenance. Wool had value in clothing and trade. Horsehair had resilience but was not available to everyone. Straw remained useful because it was cheap, familiar, and replaceable. It stayed in the household long after people had begun to dream beyond it. The desire for cleaner bedding was partly practical and partly cultural. As ideas about household management developed, especially among middling and literate classes, the bed became a place where discipline and respectability could be displayed. A well-kept bed suggested a well-kept household. White linen, where affordable, carried a powerful message because it showed dirt quickly and therefore advertised washing. To own clean sheets was one thing. To keep them clean was another. Washing linen required water, fuel, soap, or other cleaning agents, tubs, space, time, and strong arms. A clean bed was not simply purchased. It was produced repeatedly through labor. For servants, this rising standard could increase work without necessarily improving their own sleep. They might shake, air, turn, and dress the beds of their employers, smoothing linens and plumping mattresses they would never sleep on themselves. They might carry out chamber pots, beat bedding, brush curtains, sweep floors, and manage fires so that someone else's rest appeared orderly. Then, after the household settled, they might return to a narrower bed, a poorer mattress, or a straw pallet in a colder space. The history of bedding is filled with this quiet division. The people who made comfort and the people who received it were often not the same. In wealthier homes, the bed could become almost architectural. Heavy frames, curtains, testers, bolsters, layered mattresses, and decorative textiles created an enclosed sleeping world. But even there, comfort had complications. Curtains trapped warmth, but also dust. Soft bedding could shelter bedbugs. Feather beds could become musty if damp. Fine textiles required protection from moths, smoke, and wear. The wealthy could buy more comfort, but they did not escape all the physical problems of the age. What they possessed was not perfect cleanliness or perfect sleep, but more options, more servants, and more material between themselves and discomfort. For those still sleeping on straw, the contrast must have been felt with particular force in households where different classes lived under the same roof. A lower servant carrying fresh linen into a master's chamber might notice the thick curtains, the layered coverings, the height of the bedstead, the cleaner smell, the better light, the relative privacy. Later, lying down on a straw mattress in a shared attic or kitchen corner, the servant did not need political theory to understand inequality. It was in the back, the hips, the cold feet, the bites, and the knowledge of who slept softly nearby. Yet it would be too simple to imagine everyone below the wealthy longing constantly for featherbeds. Practical people often judged bedding by durability, warmth, and what it cost to maintain. A very soft bed could be seen as indulgent, unhealthy, or morally weakening in some traditions. Harder sleeping could be associated with discipline, rustic strength, military endurance, or religious humility. In many cultures and periods, too much softness carried suspicion. Comfort was desired, but it also had to be morally explained. The straw bed could therefore sit at an interesting crossroads. Humble, rough, useful, sometimes despised, sometimes defended as honest simplicity. Medical ideas also shaped attitudes toward sleep surfaces. Earlier beliefs about the body, humors, ventilation, dampness, and cold influenced how people understood beds. A damp mattress could be feared not only because it was unpleasant, but because dampness was associated with illness. Night air, drafts, and cold surfaces were all interpreted through medical frameworks that changed over time. People might not have understood germs in a modern sense, but they were keen observers of bad smells, moisture, decay, and the way sickness seemed to cluster in crowded, dirty places. The straw bed, when stale or damp, could easily become part of those anxieties. The smell of old straw mattered more than we might assume. In a world before modern chemical cleaning, smell was one of the primary ways people judged the condition of things. Sweet, dry straw suggested freshness. Sour, musty straw suggested trouble. A mattress that smelled wrong did not merely offend the senses. It warned of damp, rot, or neglect. The nose became a household instrument. People learned to read bedding by scent, touch, and sound. A bed that rustled dryly was different from one that clumped heavily. A mattress that lifted easily was different from one that felt dead and sodden beneath the hand. Urban life made the problem sharper in some ways. Towns offered more goods, but not necessarily more space or cleanliness. Poor urban dwellers might live in cramped rooms, cellars, garrets, lodging houses, or subdivided buildings where bedding was shared by shifting occupants. Straw in such places could become badly used, rarely aired, and mixed with the dirt of streets and workshops. Rural straw at least had a direct link to fields and seasonal renewal. Urban straw might arrive as a purchased or scavenged commodity, already of uncertain quality, and then remain in use under crowded conditions. In lodging houses, the bed could lose the last traces of domestic care. A family bed, however rough, was usually known to the people who used it. Its stains, lumps, repairs, and smells belonged to the household. A lodging bed belonged to no one fully. It passed from body to body, night after night, carrying the anxieties of strangers. Travelers complained frequently in historical records about bad beds, dirty sheets, fleas, and vermin. Even when they exaggerated, the complaints reveal a world in which paying for shelter did not guarantee rest. The straw mattress in a cheap lodging could be less a bed than a temporary truce with exhaustion. For the very poor, straw might not even be contained in a proper sack. Loose straw spread on the floor, straw pallets with poor ticking, or improvised bedding from old sacks and rags could serve when money failed. In moments of crisis, such as famine, displacement, war, eviction, or seasonal unemployment, the line between bed and floor could vanish. A person might sleep on straw in a barn, stable, shed, warehouse, almshouse, roadside shelter, or parish facility. The material was the same, but the meaning changed with the circumstances. Straw inside a cared-for home was one thing. Straw under a desperate body in a temporary shelter was another. This is why straw appears so often in the background of hardship. It was present when people were born in poor houses, when the sick were laid down, when soldiers rested between marches, when travelers stopped at inns, when prisoners endured confinement, when animals and humans shared cramped shelter, and when institutions provided the cheapest form of bedding they could justify. It was ordinary enough to be invisible, but common enough to appear wherever society touched its limits. And yet, straw also carried a kind of resilience. Because it was simple, it could be managed without specialized manufacture. A household did not need a factory to create a straw mattress. It needed cloth, straw, labor, and the knowledge of how to fill, tie, turn, and renew it. In remote places, in poor years, or in temporary settlements, that mattered. Straw was local. It did not depend on distant trade. It could be gathered after harvest, stored in barns, and brought into the home when needed. The same quality that made it humble also made it dependable. The shift away from straw, therefore, was not only a story of technology improving comfort. It was also a story of dependence changing form. A straw bed depended on the harvest and household labor. A manufactured mattress depended on markets, wages, transport, industrial materials, and cash. For those with money, the newer systems could bring cleaner, more stable, more comfortable sleep. For those without it, straw and other cheap fillings remained. Modern comfort did not arrive evenly. It moved through class, geography, and time in uneven waves. In the early modern and modernizing world, beds became more tied to ideas of respectability. Owning a bed, and especially a decent bed with proper coverings, could be a sign of household stability. In some inventories, beds were among the most valuable possessions ordinary people owned. They were listed carefully because they mattered economically. A bed was not disposable furniture. It could be inherited, pawned, seized for debt, included in marriage arrangements, or counted as a family asset. The presence of straw within it might not reduce its importance. Even a modest bedstead with a straw mattress, sheets, and blankets represented material security. That detail is easy to overlook. A straw bed might sound poor to us, but to someone with almost nothing, it could be property worth protecting. Losing bedding could be devastating. Without it, one was closer to the floor, the cold, the charity of others, or the open air. In households with fragile finances, bedding belonged to the thin line between poverty and destitution. The mattress may have scratched. It may have smelled of smoke. It may have held fleas. But it was still a possession, a shelter within shelter. The law and charity sometimes recognized this indirectly. Poor relief, almshouses, hospitals, military authorities, and prisons all had to think about bedding because bodies cannot be stored without consequences. To provide straw was to acknowledge a minimum need. To fail to change it was to reveal neglect. Reformers who visited institutions often noticed bedding because bedding made suffering visible. A filthy straw pallet could stand for an entire system's failure. It showed, in one glance, what the vulnerable were expected to endure. The language of straw also became moral language. To be laid on straw could suggest poverty, humility, degradation, or simplicity. In some stories, a person on straw is close to nature or close to suffering. In others, straw marks a lowly birth, a prison cell, a sick room, or a final decline. The material was so familiar that it could carry emotional weight instantly. People understood what it meant to lie on straw. They understood the distance between straw and feathers, between a pallet and a curtained bed, between being sheltered and being cared for. Still, the daily reality remained more ordinary than symbolic. Most nights, a person did not lie down thinking of what straw represented in literature or moral thought. They thought of warmth, space, tiredness, children, tomorrow's work, the ache in a limb, the sound of weather, the need not to disturb others. They adjusted the bedding, pulled the covering closer, turned away from a draft, and waited for the body to surrender. History often hides in exactly that kind of repeated gesture. As bedding standards rose, the connection between bed and privacy strengthened. Separate bedrooms became more common in some social groups over time, though unevenly and gradually. Sleeping alone or only with a spouse became more desirable where architecture and income allowed it. The crowded straw bed began to belong, in polite imagination, to an older, poorer, less refined world. But millions still lived in conditions where separation was impossible. Even when ideals changed, walls did not build themselves, and wages did not instantly buy mattresses. The move toward privacy altered the emotional experience of sleep. In a crowded room, the body had to negotiate with others. In a private room, the bed became more personal, more associated with individual comfort, health, and identity. The straw mattress was less suited to this new ideal because it reminded people of shared labor, agricultural residue, and household roughness. Newer mattresses promised a different relationship with the night. Quieter, cleaner, more controlled, less directly tied to the barn and field. But control was always relative. Even improved beds could carry pests. Even better rooms could be cold. Even cleaner linen required washing. The past did not move neatly from misery to comfort. It moved through compromises. A household might own a better mattress but still sleep in a damp room. A family might have clean sheets but little heat. A servant might make a beautiful bed and then sleep poorly elsewhere. A farm might replace some straw bedding while still using straw for children, hired laborers, or seasonal workers. Old and new coexisted for a long time. There is a quiet irony in this. Straw bedding helped support the very societies that eventually came to look down on it. It allowed workers to rest enough to harvest grain, build houses, serve households, fight wars, raise children, carry goods, and keep institutions running. It was part of the hidden infrastructure of labor. Without cheap bedding, poor bodies would have had even less recovery. Yet as standards changed, the material that had made survival possible became a sign of backwardness. The industrial age would deepen this divide. Factories, wage labor, urban crowding, and mass-produced goods began to reshape domestic expectations. Mattresses filled with cotton, wool, horsehair, and later springs or manufactured materials slowly became more available, though not equally. Advertisements would eventually teach people to think of sleep as something that could be improved by purchase. Comfort became commercial. The bed became a product with claims, qualities, and promises. Against that new world, straw looked older, rougher, almost primitive. But before those promises reached everyone, straw remained in use in cottages, farms, barracks, institutions, and emergency shelters. It persisted because history does not replace the poor person's belongings just because the middle class has new standards. A new mattress in a shop window did not help someone without the money to buy it. A reformer's complaint about dirty straw did not automatically provide clean bedding. A changing idea of comfort could make suffering more visible without immediately reducing it. For many households, the first real improvement may have been modest. Better ticking, more frequent airing, a second layer, a cleaner sheet, a raised frame, a better blanket, or access to drier storage. These small changes mattered. They reduced contact with damp, improved warmth, limited some dust, and gave the sleeper a little more dignity. History should not only measure progress by dramatic inventions. Sometimes progress was a woman finally having enough spare cloth to patch the mattress properly, or a family obtaining an extra blanket before winter, or a servant being moved from the kitchen floor to a narrow bedstead in an attic. The emotional history of bedding lives in those small gains. A child moved from loose straw on the floor to a sack mattress. A young couple beginning married life with a bed listed among their possessions. A laborer returning from the road to a familiar pallet. An elderly parent given the warmer side of the room. A sick person's straw changed at last. These moments did not make history books, but they shaped the human experience of the past more intimately than many events that did. And as expectations changed, people began to speak more openly about the relationship between bedding and health. Damp beds, foul straw, poor ventilation, crowding, and vermin all became targets of concern. Reformers, doctors, charitable visitors, and household advisors increasingly treated the bed as a site where poverty could damage the body. The straw mattress was no longer only a practical object. It became evidence in arguments about housing, sanitation, labor, morality, and social responsibility. That shift is important because it marks the beginning of a new question. Earlier households asked, "What can we sleep on with what we have?" Later reformers increasingly asked, "What should a human being be expected to sleep on?" The difference seems small, but it changes everything. One question accepts scarcity as the frame. The other begins to challenge it. Yet even then, the answer did not come quickly. The old straw mattress remained under bodies while debates about cleanliness, poverty, industry, and domestic reform moved slowly above them. In cottages and crowded rooms, in military quarters and poorhouses, in barns during harvest and cheap lodgings along busy roads, people still lowered themselves at night onto bedding that rustled with the older world. And as the 19th century pushed more people into cities, factories, rented rooms, and institutional care, the humble straw bed would reveal something even more unsettling. That progress in public life did not always mean comfort in private darkness. Progress in public life did not always mean comfort in private darkness, because the same century that brought railways, gaslight, factories, printed newspapers, expanding shops, and louder promises of improvement also crowded many working people into rooms where sleep remained as rough and uncertain as it had been for generations. The city might glow more brightly than the village. Goods might travel faster. Wages might be paid in cash rather than crops. But when the door closed at night, a laborer, seamstress, dock worker, washerwoman, apprentice, or child in a rented room could still find a bed made from the cheapest materials available, and straw was often still close to the bottom of that ladder. Urban poverty changed the meaning of straw because it loosened the older connection between bedding and household self-sufficiency. In a rural cottage, however poor, straw often came from a known agricultural world. It came from nearby fields, barns, neighbors, rent arrangements, or the cycle of harvest. In the city, straw could become a purchased scrap of comfort, an item supplied by a landlord, a lodging keeper, a parish authority, an employer, or an institution. The sleeper no longer always knew where it had come from, how old it was, who had used it before, or when it would be changed. The material remained familiar, but the relationship to it became less personal and often more insecure. This mattered deeply in lodging houses, where beds were not always attached to stable households. People arrived with bundles, tools, exhaustion, debts, and sometimes no certainty about where they would sleep the next night. A bed might be rented by the night. A place on a shared mattress might be cheaper than a bed alone. A straw pallet might be one step above the floor. The keeper of the lodging house had to balance cost, space, and profit, and the poorest guests had little power to demand freshness. A mattress filled with straw could become a silent record of strangers, each leaving behind the traces of work, weather, illness, sweat, road dust, and fear of tomorrow. And such places, sleep was not simply rest. It was a transaction. A person paid for shelter from the street, but not necessarily for cleanliness, quiet, or dignity. The bed might be narrow, the room crowded, the air stale, and the straw old enough to have lost any softness it once had. If the sleeper complained, there might be nowhere else to go at the same price. The city gave people choices in theory, but poverty narrowed them until choice became almost symbolic. To sleep on straw in a cheap lodging was to understand that the market could sell even discomfort in measured portions. Factories changed the body that came to the bed. Rural labor had been exhausting in its own seasonal, weather-bound way. Industrial labor brought another rhythm. Long hours indoors, repetitive movements, dust from materials, noise, heat, strict timekeeping, and the pressure of wages. Workers came home or to lodgings with bodies tired differently than those of field laborers. The straw bed received this new fatigue. A person who had stood for hours, bent over machinery, carried loads in warehouses, hauled coal, stitched garments in poor light, or worked around smoke and grease might lie down with muscles tense from labor that had not followed the sun but the clock. The clock is important here. In older rural life, sleep was tied closely to daylight, season, animals, weather, and household need. In industrial towns, the bell, whistle, shift, and employer's schedule increasingly shaped rest. The bed became a place where the body tried to recover quickly enough to meet external time. A poor mattress mattered more when the morning demanded punctuality. Oversleeping could cost wages. Poor sleep could mean slower work, mistakes, injury, dismissal, or simply another day endured with less strength. Straw did not only cushion the body, it participated in the economics of fatigue. For women doing paid work at home, the line between bed and labor could be especially thin. Seamstresses, pieceworkers, laundresses, and other poor workers might occupy rooms where bedding, tools, garments, food, children, and debts all shared the same air. A straw mattress might be folded, pushed aside, or used as seating during the day. It might absorb the smell of damp linen, cooking, coal smoke, thread dust, or street air. At night, the worker lay down in the same cramped environment where the day's labor had taken place. Sleep did not remove her from work. It only changed her posture within it. Children in crowded urban rooms grew up with beds that were often shared, improvised, and negotiated. Several might sleep crosswise to fit more bodies under one covering. Younger children might be tucked near adults for warmth. Older ones might be sent to corners, pallets, or makeshift bedding. Straw could scratch and rustle beneath them, but it was also the known geography of the room. The child learned where to place a foot in darkness, where the floor was coldest, who took the warmest side, and how to stay still enough not to wake someone whose sleep mattered to the next day's wages. The rise of reform movements brought outsiders into these rooms, at least in words and reports. Visitors, inspectors, philanthropists, doctors, clergy, and social investigators increasingly wrote about the sleeping conditions of the poor. They noticed overcrowding, vermin, bad ventilation, damp bedding, and the moral and physical dangers they believed followed from such conditions. Their language could be sympathetic, judgmental, fearful, or reforming, depending on who wrote it. But again and again, the bed appeared as evidence. A poor straw mattress was no longer merely a private object. It became a public sign that something in the social order was failing. Yet reform could carry its own misunderstandings. Middle-class observers sometimes looked at poor bedding and assumed laziness, disorder, or moral weakness, when the deeper causes were low wages, insecure work, high rents, limited space, exhaustion, and the cost of cleaning. It is one thing to tell a poor family to keep bedding fresh. It is another to provide the money, water, fuel, storage, time, and replacement materials that make freshness possible. A straw bed did not become foul because people lacked a desire for decency. It became foul because poverty attacks maintenance first. This is one of the quiet truths of domestic hardship. The first night on a poor mattress may be uncomfortable. The 100th night reveals the system. A family may intend to change the straw but need the money for bread. A servant may know bedding should be aired but have too much work and too little authority. A lodging keeper may replace straw only when forced. A parish institution may calculate exactly how little bedding can be supplied without open scandal. Neglect often appears as a moral failure in individuals, but it is frequently produced by pressures that sit outside the room. Workhouses and poor relief institutions made this tension visible. In places designed to shelter the destitute while discouraging dependency, bedding could be deliberately plain. Straw mattresses or pallets suited the institutional logic. Cheap, austere, and easy to justify as sufficient but not comfortable enough to attract the undeserving, as some authorities imagined them. The bed became part of policy. It was not meant to invite rest in the fullest sense. It was meant to provide a minimum while preserving a moral lesson about poverty, labor, and discipline. For the people inside, that moral lesson was felt physically. The straw mattress in an institution had a different emotional weight from the straw mattress at home. At home, even poor bedding might belong to family life, memory, and small acts of care. In an institution, bedding could feel anonymous. It was issued, inspected, regulated, and sometimes shared in conditions that emphasized dependence. The sleeper did not control when it was changed, where it was placed, or who had used it before. The bed became another reminder that poverty could strip a person not only of comfort, but of authority over the smallest rituals of the body. Prisons and military barracks used straw for similar reasons of economy and control, though under different systems. Straw could be distributed, gathered, replaced, or withheld, could be spread on platforms, stuffed into sacks, or used in temporary quarters. Authorities valued it because it was cheap and simple. In crowded settings, however, its very simplicity became dangerous to comfort and cleanliness. A clean straw mattress required regular attention. An old one could become an object of humiliation. For prisoners, soldiers, and institutional inmates, the bed was not a private possession but part of a managed environment, and the quality of rest depended on the priorities of those in charge. There is a striking reversal here. In a cottage, straw bedding had once represented household resourcefulness. The field entering the home, the family making use of what it had. In an institution, the same material could represent administrative minimalism, the cheapest acceptable surface on which to place human bodies. The straw did not change. The power relationship around it did. At the same time, many reformers genuinely understood that bedding was linked to health. As 19th century concerns about sanitation, ventilation, contagion, and urban crowding grew, the sleeping space became an object of scrutiny. People increasingly connected bad air, damp rooms, dirty bedding, and sickness. Even before every mechanism of disease was fully understood, there was a growing practical awareness that stale bedding and overcrowded sleep were not harmless. The bed was no longer just where the day ended. It was where the conditions of poverty entered the lungs, the skin, the joints, and the nervous exhaustion of daily life. In working-class homes that slowly improved, the changes might be modest but meaningful. A raised bedstead instead of a floor pallet, a mattress with better ticking, a layer of wool or flock above straw, more frequent washing of sheets, a separate bed for children as wages allowed, a blanket bought secondhand, a room with slightly better ventilation. These improvements did not transform life into comfort as we know it, but they changed the night. They reduced the number of indignities the body had to accept before sleep. Second-hand markets played a role in this world of gradual improvement. Bedding, bed frames, blankets, and linens circulated through pawn shops, auctions, charity, inheritance, and informal exchange. A family might acquire what another had discarded, but second-hand bedding brought anxieties of its own. It might carry pests, smells, stains, or associations with illness and death. To buy used bedding was often necessary, but not always reassuring. A cheap mattress could be both an upgrade and a risk. The poor were repeatedly asked to solve one problem by accepting another. The idea of the clean bed began to grow stronger, not merely as luxury but as a moral and medical standard. In advice literature, charitable instruction, and domestic manuals, cleanliness in bedding was praised as part of good household order. But again, the advice often assumed access to resources. To wash linen well, one needed more than virtue. Water had to be fetched or paid for. Fuel had to heat it. Soap had to be bought or made. Drying required space and weather. In a damp urban court or cramped tenement, keeping bedding clean could be an achievement so difficult that outsiders mistook its absence for neglect. The bed also became tied to respectability in marriage and family formation. For couples beginning a household, a bed could be one of the first major possessions. Even if the mattress was partly straw, the bed represented independence. It was a sign that the couple had crossed from dependency into their own domestic economy. A bedstead, ticking, sheets, and covers could be accumulated slowly, gifted, saved for, or inherited. To own bedding was to hold a small claim against the instability of the world. But instability remained close. Illness, unemployment, death of a wage earner, rent increases, or seasonal downturns could force families to pawn bedding. This was especially devastating because bedding was both practical and symbolic. To pawn a blanket or mattress was to trade future warmth for immediate survival. The family might retrieve it if wages returned, or lose it if poverty deepened. The straw bed, already humble, could be stripped further until only the least comfortable layers remained. Night after night, these pressures shaped the experience of sleep. A person lying on straw in a crowded city room might hear not the quiet of countryside but the noises of urban life. Carts, footsteps, tavern sounds, factory movements, neighbors through thin walls, water pumps, crying children, coughing, bells, shouting in the street, or the heavy silence that comes after too much noise has finally faded. Straw rustled beneath them as it had for centuries, but the world around it had changed. The bed carried an older material into a modernizing soundscape. Coal smoke altered the atmosphere too. In industrial towns, soot entered rooms, settled on surfaces and darkened fabrics. Bedding could take on the smell of coal, damp brick, and crowded streets. The old rural straw smell, dry and grassy when fresh, mingled with urban air. This created a new kind of discomfort. Not the barn-like closeness of animals and fields, but the industrial closeness of smoke, dust, and cramped human settlement. The straw mattress was no longer just part of an agricultural economy. It had been pulled into the industrial one. For migrants arriving from the countryside, this must have produced mixed feelings. A straw bed in the city might resemble something familiar, but the room around it did not. There might be no field nearby, no barn, no seasonal sense of renewal, no family storage of fresh straw after harvest. Instead, there was rent, the landlord, the lodging keeper, the factory bell, the unfamiliar neighbor, the crowded stair, the shared privy, the street beyond the door. The bed's material belonged to one world, while the sleeper's life was being reorganized by another. Domestic reformers sometimes tried to teach better habits of ventilation and bedding care, encouraging windows to be opened, bedding to be aired, and rooms to be kept orderly. These suggestions could help when conditions allowed, but they could also collide with fear of cold, theft, bad weather, polluted air, and lack of space. Opening a window in a freezing room was not simple. Airing bedding when there was nowhere safe or dry to put it was not simple. Removing old straw when replacement cost money was not simple. Good advice becomes less useful when it does not fully understand the room. This tension between advice and reality appears again and again in the history of sleep. Those with resources define standards. Those without resources are judged for failing to meet them. The straw mattress sits quietly in the middle, absorbing both the physical burdens of poverty and the moral language attached to it. Still, change continued. As industrial production expanded, more bedding materials entered the market. Cotton became increasingly important in textiles. Better transport moved goods more widely. Metal bed frames, though not immediately universal, offered some advantages over older wooden frames because they could be less hospitable to certain pests and easier to clean. Manufactured mattresses gradually became more visible. Advertisements began to promise not merely a place to sleep, but healthier, cleaner, more modern rest. Sleep was being reimagined as something that could be engineered. For people accustomed to straw, such promises must have sounded both attractive and distant. A cleaner mattress, a bed less likely to harbor insects, a surface that did not collapse into ridges after weeks of use. These were not trivial luxuries. They addressed old nightly irritations. But price remained the gatekeeper. Modern bedding could exist in the same city where children still slept on straw pallets. Industrial society produced abundance and inequality side by side. The shop window and the lodging house belonged to the same street. The older straw bed, therefore, became a kind of historical survivor. It persisted in the spaces where money, reform, and new standards arrived last. Farms still used it, Seasonal laborers still encountered it. Institutions still relied on it. Poor families still stretched its usefulness. It remained in barns, barracks, cottages, attics, ships, shelters, and emergency bedding. The world could speak of progress while straw continued to rustle under bodies too poor, too transient, or too controlled to claim anything better. And this persistence tells us something important about comfort itself. Comfort is not simply invented and then shared. It has to be distributed. A society may know how to make better beds long before everyone sleeps on one. It may understand the value of clean bedding while still allowing many to lie down in damp or crowded rooms. It may praise home as a refuge while making that refuge unaffordable for thousands. The straw mattress remained because knowledge alone does not change material life. Money, policy, labor, housing, and social priority do. By the late 19th century and into the changing domestic world that followed, the bed increasingly became a measure of modern living. Reformers counted beds. Inspectors described overcrowded rooms. Charities distributed blankets. Manufacturers advertised mattresses. Doctors spoke of ventilation and hygiene. Families aspired to separate sleeping spaces. Yet beneath this growing language of improvement, many people still faced the same ancient question in a newer form. What surface will hold my body tonight, and will it let me rise tomorrow? That question carried the story of straw into a world of iron bedsteads, cotton ticking, factory-made bedding, public health campaigns, and urban housing debates. The material that had once seemed like a natural extension of the harvest was now becoming a sign of the conditions modern society hoped to leave behind, even as it continued to rely on it wherever poverty made old solutions necessary. And as the meaning of a decent night's sleep began to change, the poorest beds became harder to ignore because they revealed not only how people slept, but how much discomfort a society was still willing to treat as normal. What a society was still willing to treat as normal could often be seen most clearly at night, when public confidence faded and ordinary bodies had to meet ordinary surfaces. During the day, a city could present itself through shopfronts, railway stations, factories, churches, civic buildings, schools, and markets. It could speak the language of progress, improvement, empire, industry, science, and moral reform. But at night, in the rooms above shops, behind courts, inside lodging houses, in farm cottages, barracks, hospitals, and poor relief institutions, the truth became more intimate. The question was not what the age claimed to have achieved. The question was how people actually slept. A straw mattress had become, by this point, more than a rural habit. It was a boundary marker. It marked the place where improvement had not yet reached, or had reached only partially. Some families moved beyond straw and used it only as a base layer, or abandoned it for flock, cotton, wool, hair, or manufactured mattresses. Others remained tied to it because it was cheap, because landlords supplied little else, because institutions calculated costs, or because seasonal labor still demanded temporary bedding wherever workers could be housed. Straw survived not because people failed to imagine comfort, but because comfort required money, space, stability, and the power to insist. The poorest sleepers often lacked all four. In crowded urban housing, the bed was frequently part of a larger struggle over space. A family might rent one room and use it as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, nursery, storage area, and sick room. A straw mattress might be rolled or pushed aside during the day, then spread again at night. Bedding could not always be properly aired because the room itself was always occupied, always needed, always full of objects that had nowhere else to go. Even when people understood that bedding should be freshened, the practical question remained: freshened where? A bed cannot be easily cleaned when there is no spare room, no yard, no dry weather, no time, and no second mattress to use while the first is being dealt with. This is why the history of straw bedding cannot be separated from the history of housing. A bed is only as healthy as the room that holds it. A dry mattress in a damp cellar soon becomes damp. A fresh straw sack in a verminous lodging house does not remain fresh for long. A raised frame helps only if there is enough space to place it. Clean linen matters only if it can be washed, dried, and stored away from dirt. The bed was the final layer of a whole environment, and when that environment failed, the mattress absorbed the failure. In this way, the straw bed became a silent witness to urban overcrowding. It lay beneath children who had no separate room, workers who shared beds and shifts, lodgers who rented sleeping places rather than homes, and families who measured dignity by whether everyone could at least lie indoors. In some places, beds were used by more than one person across different hours, a practice associated with extreme crowding and low wages. The mattress did not belong to rest as much as to rotation. One exhausted body rose, another took its place, and the bedding had little chance to recover between them. The old rural straw bed had followed the rhythm of harvest and household maintenance. The urban shared bed followed the rhythm of labor markets. It was shaped by factory hours, dock work, domestic service, casual employment, and the harsh arithmetic of rent. A person might not sleep badly because the straw itself was uniquely terrible, but because the straw was never allowed to become fully clean, dry, quiet, or personal. It was overused. It was under-maintained. It was asked to serve too many bodies with too little care. There is a particular loneliness in that kind of shared discomfort. A crowded room is not the same as companionship. A person could be surrounded by breathing bodies and still have no privacy, no softness, and no real sense of safety. The straw rustled whenever someone shifted. A cough traveled through the room. A child's movement disturbed a tired adult. The air grew stale. The blanket was too thin. The wall was too close. The body learned not to expect the night to belong to itself. For women and girls, crowded sleeping arrangements could carry additional anxieties. Privacy had always been limited among the poor, but in lodging houses, servant quarters, and overcrowded dwellings, the sleeping body could feel exposed. Respectability in the 19th century increasingly emphasized modesty, separation, and domestic order, yet many working people lived in spaces where those ideals were physically impossible. A young servant might sleep in a corner or shared attic. A girl in a crowded family room might have little separation from brothers, parents, lodgers, or boarders. Straw bedding, low to the floor or thinly enclosed, made the vulnerability of the body difficult to ignore. The bed, therefore, became part of a broader moral conversation. Reformers worried about overcrowded sleeping not only because of disease, but because of what they believed it did to family life, modesty, discipline, and social order. Some of their fears were shaped by class prejudice, but the physical problem was real. Too many people in too little space made privacy impossible. The poor were then judged for lacking a kind of domestic separation that their wages could not buy. The straw mattress, once again, sat at the center of a contradiction. Society praised modest, orderly homes while allowing many people only one room in which everything had to happen. In rural areas, meanwhile, straw bedding continued in older patterns, though not untouched by change. Farmers, laborers, and seasonal workers still used straw because agriculture produced it and because rural economies remained cautious with cash. A cottage might maintain a straw mattress for children, hired hands, or temporary workers even if the main bed improved. During harvest, extra workers needed places to sleep. Barns, lofts, outbuildings, and temporary quarters might be filled with makeshift bedding. In these settings, straw could still feel practical, even welcome, especially after long days in the fields. But the comfort was fragile. A dry barn and fresh straw were one thing. A cold, damp, rodent-haunted sleeping place was another. Seasonal laborers often occupied the uncertain edge between household and institution. They might be lodged by employers, sleep in barns, share rough quarters, or move from place to place as work demanded. Their bedding reflected their temporary status. A permanent family might repair a mattress because it would be used for years. A temporary worker might receive whatever was sufficient for a few nights or weeks. The straw beneath them did not represent belonging. It represented usefulness. They were housed because their labor was needed, not necessarily because their comfort mattered. This distinction is crucial. Bedding can reveal whether a person is treated as a member of a household, a customer, a dependent, a worker, a prisoner, a patient, or a burden. The same straw sack changes meaning depending on the relationship around it. In a family home, someone may have filled it with care. In a lodging house, someone may have filled it for profit. In a barrack, someone may have issued it for discipline. In a workhouse, someone may have provided it as a warning against destitution. In a hospital, someone may have placed it beneath a body because there was no cheaper way to manage need at scale. Hospitals, especially before modern standards fully developed, make the problem especially clear. A sick person on straw required more care, not less. The mattress could become soiled, compressed, and unhealthy if left unchanged. Yet institutions were often crowded, understaffed, and governed by budgets. Straw's cheapness made it useful, but sickness made its weaknesses more serious. The bedridden body could not shift enough to escape pressure. Dampness and dirt mattered more. Clean bedding became part of treatment, but treatment depended on resources. A bed could either support recovery or quietly worsen suffering. As medical thinking developed, the bed became more closely tied to ideas of hygiene. Fresh air, clean linen, dry bedding, and separation from filth were increasingly emphasized. Nurses, reformers, and physicians paid attention to the patient's bed not as a background object, but as part of care itself. The older practice of simply placing a body on whatever bedding was available began to look inadequate. Straw could still be used, especially when changed frequently, but the demand for more washable, controllable, and durable materials grew stronger. The word washable marks a major turning point. Straw itself could not truly be washed and restored in the way cloth or later manufactured materials might be cleaned. It could be replaced, aired, or discarded. That made it acceptable where replacement was easy and regular. But in practice, replacement was exactly where poverty and institutions often failed. A material that depended on frequent renewal became a problem when renewal was delayed. New bedding technologies promised not only softness but manageability. They promised surfaces that could be cleaned, inspected, standardized, and sold as healthier. Standardization became one of the great forces changing sleep. The handmade straw mattress varied from house to house, season to season, and filling to filling. Industrial bedding could be advertised in consistent terms. Sizes, materials, construction, quality, hygiene, durability. This did not mean every product fulfilled its promises, but the very idea of a standard bed shifted expectations. A person could begin to think of a mattress not as a sack to be filled, emptied, and endured, but as a manufactured object designed to perform. That shift also changed trust. With a straw mattress, trust was local. You trusted the straw you had stored, the person who filled the ticking, the household routine that maintained it. With a manufactured mattress, trust moved outward toward makers, sellers, labels, advertisements, and eventually standards of production. The bed became part of a market language. Comfort was described, compared, branded, and priced. Sleep became something that could be improved by choosing correctly, if one had the money to choose. For many people, of course, choice remained limited. The rise of modern bedding did not immediately remove straw from the lives of the poor. It did, however, make straw appear increasingly old-fashioned and inadequate. This change in perception mattered. A person sleeping on straw in an earlier rural society might be doing what nearly everyone around them had done. A person sleeping on straw in a modernizing city might be painfully aware that other beds existed, were advertised, and were considered normal for respectable homes. Discomfort became sharpened by comparison. Comparison is one of the hidden engines of modern domestic history. People did not simply become more comfortable because new goods appeared. They became more aware of discomfort because new standards circulated. Shop windows, catalogs, advice books, employers' homes, charitable visits, and the talk of neighbors all showed what a better bed might look like. Aspirations entered the room before the mattress did. A family could want cleaner bedding years before they could afford it. A servant could know the feel of fine linen through labor long before she slept in it. A child might understand poverty by seeing another child's bed. At the same time, straw retained a place in memory. For some, it came to represent hardship overcome. For others, rural childhood, seasonal work, barns, poverty, or wartime improvisation. Nostalgia softened the edges for people remembering from a safer distance. A night on fresh straw in a barn might become a charming anecdote if it was temporary and chosen. But the same material, endured without choice through cold months and crowded years, had a very different emotional weight. History must keep those two memories separate. The occasional rustic adventure and the long-term condition of poverty are not the same experience. The changing bed also altered the work of housekeeping. A straw mattress required filling, turning, emptying, and refilling. A newer mattress required cleaning of its cover, airing, protection from damp, and eventual replacement, but it did not usually require the same intimate relationship with agricultural material. This reduced some forms of household labor while creating others. Clean sheets still had to be washed. Rooms still had to be ventilated. Pests still had to be fought. But the nightly surface became less directly connected to the field and more connected to industry. This had symbolic power. The old straw bed reminded sleepers that human comfort depended on the harvest. The newer mattress suggested that comfort could be separated from seasonal cycles and produced by manufacturing. It offered a kind of independence from the field, though not from the market. For urban families especially, this mattered. A bed bought from a shop, however modest, could feel like participation in a more modern domestic world. It said that the household was not merely surviving with remnants. It was purchasing comfort in a form recognized by others. But for the poorest, market comfort could be cruel because it turned rest into another commodity. A better mattress existed, but at a price. A cleaner lodging existed, but at a price. More space existed, but at a price. The body needed sleep whether or not wages allowed it. Straw remained the answer where the market's better answers were unreachable. In this sense, the straw bed exposed the limits of consumer progress. Goods can be available and still be socially absent. Public health campaigns began to push against that absence. Concerns about overcrowding, sanitation, ventilation, and disease gradually influenced housing laws, institutional standards, charitable reforms, and the design of sleeping spaces. Change was slow, uneven, and often resisted, but the basic idea gained strength. Where and how people slept was not merely a private matter. It affected public health, social stability, productivity, and morality. The poor bed was no longer invisible. It had become part of the public question of how a modern society should house its people. Even then, the reformers' gaze could be double-edged. Could bring help, but also intrusion. Poor families might need better bedding, but they did not always welcome outsiders inspecting their rooms, judging their habits, or translating hardship into reports. The straw mattress could be used as evidence for reform, but also as evidence against the poor themselves. The people sleeping on it had to endure not only the material discomfort, but the possibility of being observed and interpreted by those with more power. This is why a trustworthy history of straw bedding must keep returning to agency. People did what they could. They shook bedding, saved for blankets, patched ticking, shared warmth, protected children, bargained with landlords, accepted charity when necessary, resisted institutions when possible, and adapted to rooms that modern people would find almost impossible. Their beds were not simply proof of ignorance. They were proof of constraint. The difference matters. The gradual decline of straw as a common household mattress filling did not erase its long history. It lingered in language, memory, institutions, and emergency use. During wars, disasters, migrations, and sudden crowding, straw could return quickly because it still offered the old advantage. It was available, cheap, and better than bare ground. In moments when systems broke down, societies rediscovered the usefulness of simple materials. The modern mattress might define ordinary comfort, but straw remained waiting at the edge of crisis. And perhaps that is one reason this subject feels so quietly unsettling. Sleeping on straw is not only a story about the distant poor. It is a reminder that comfort depends on systems that can fail. Agriculture, housing, wages, sanitation, trade, family stability, fuel, textiles, and public care. Remove enough of those supports, and the human body returns quickly to older questions. What can be gathered? What can be spread beneath us? What will keep out the cold for one more night? In ordinary times, people rarely notice the infrastructure of sleep. The mattress is simply there. The sheets are simply clean. The room is simply private. The air is simply breathable. But for most of history, none of those things were simple. They were built slowly through labor, material change, social expectation, and unequal access. The straw bed reveals the long road between exhaustion and rest. By the early 20th century, in many places, the idea of a decent bed had moved further away from straw. Metal frames, cotton mattresses, improved bedding industries, public health advice, and changing domestic expectations had begun to reshape what many families hoped for, even if not all could obtain it. Straw increasingly belonged to marginal situations. Farms, temporary lodgings, military necessity, institutional austerity, poverty at the edges, and memories of an older rural world. But the transition was incomplete, and the people still sleeping on straw were not relics. They were living alongside modernity, close enough to see its promises, but not always close enough to feel them under their backs. And that uneven closeness leads us toward the next part of the story. The moment when straw stopped being understood mainly as an ordinary bedding material and began to stand for something society wanted to overcome. Not just rough sleep, but poverty itself. Not just a scratchy mattress, but the old assumption that some people could be expected to rest badly and rise anyway. That old assumption, that some people could be expected to rest badly and rise anyway, did not vanish simply because better beds became possible. It lingered in the way poverty was discussed, in the way institutions calculated minimum comfort, in the way employers housed temporary laborers, and in the way society often separated the idea of human need from the reality of human bodies. Straw became powerful as a symbol because it revealed that separation so clearly. It was humble, useful, and sometimes necessary, but it also asked a simple question. How little can a person be given at night and still be expected to function in the morning? By the time straw was increasingly pushed to the edges of ordinary domestic life, the world had changed around it. Bedrooms, where families could afford them, had become more private. Mattresses had become more specialized. Clean sheets became part of respectable household identity. Doctors, reformers, nurses, and public health officials spoke more forcefully about ventilation, sanitation, dryness, and the dangers of overcrowded sleep. Manufacturers promised support, hygiene, comfort, and modernity. The bed was no longer just a household object made from whatever materials could be gathered. It was becoming part of a larger standard of life. And yet, the memory of straw remained because the change had been uneven. Some people moved from straw to cotton, wool, hair, springs, or manufactured mattresses with relief. Others moved only partially, keeping straw as a base layer or using it for children, servants, farmhands, or emergency guests. Still others encountered it in moments of vulnerability. In temporary shelters, military quarters, poor lodgings, rural outbuildings, and institutions where money was short and human comfort was measured carefully against cost. Straw was no longer the center of the ordinary bed for many households, but it had not disappeared from the human night. This unevenness matters because it reminds us that comfort is not only a story of invention. It is a story of access. The knowledge that a better bed exists does not soften the mattress beneath a poor sleeper. The advertisement for a healthier night does not change the bedding in a crowded room unless wages, housing, and social priorities make that change possible. The history of sleeping on straw is therefore not simply the history of an old material being replaced. It is the history of who was allowed to feel the benefits of replacement, and who continued to live with the old compromises after others had moved beyond them. For those who did leave straw behind, the change may have felt profound in small ways. A mattress that did not need seasonal refilling. A bed less filled with dust and broken stalks. A surface that held its shape longer. A room where bedding could be aired, washed, and managed with greater regularity. A bedstead high enough to separate the sleeper from the floor. A sheet that smelled of soap rather than smoke, damp, and old straw. These changes did not always arrive together, and they did not create perfect sleep, but each one shifted the relationship between the body and the night. A better bed could change the morning. Less stiffness, fewer bites, less cold rising from below, less fear of what might be moving inside the mattress, less embarrassment when visitors saw the room, more confidence that sleep was not merely something endured, but something protected. Such improvements sound modest from a modern distance, yet for people who had known rough bedding, they could feel like a change in dignity. The body was being treated as something worth supporting. That idea that the body was worth supporting even in sleep is one of the quiet turning points of modern domestic life. Earlier societies certainly valued rest, and people always desired warmth and softness when they could get them. But the broad expectation that ordinary people should have clean, dry, personal, reasonably comfortable bedding developed slowly. It had to be built through material production, household labor, reform, wages, architecture, and changing moral imagination. It required people to believe that a decent night's sleep was not an indulgence for the wealthy, but part of a humane life. The straw bed helps us see how long that belief took to become ordinary. For centuries, millions of people accepted bedding that today would seem temporary, emergency level, or unacceptable for regular use. They did so not because they were less sensitive to discomfort, but because their world gave them fewer alternatives. They knew cold, they knew damp, they knew fleas, lice, smoke, crowding, and the hard ridge of flattened straw beneath the hip. They also knew how to endure, repair, adapt, share warmth, and make the best possible bed out of what the season and household allowed. This is where the subject becomes more human than merely uncomfortable. Straw bedding was not only a sign of suffering. It was also a sign of ingenuity under constraint. People filled sacks, patched ticking, saved cloth, turned mattresses, dried bedding in brief sunshine, tucked children close in winter, used herbs and smoke and shaking and washing where possible, and welcomed fresh straw when harvest allowed. They did not live passively inside hardship. They worked constantly to make hardship livable. Still, endurance should not be mistaken for contentment. The fact that people survived rough sleep does not mean rough sleep was harmless. A body that rises every morning from a damp, crowded, pest-ridden, or flattened bed carries the night into the day. It carries it into the field, the workshop, the kitchen, the laundry, the road, the factory, the stable, the sick room, the nursery. Poor sleep becomes slower labor, sharper tempers, weaker resistance to illness, more pain in old injuries, and less patience for the demands of life. The bed, hidden in darkness, shapes the daylight more than we often realize. And that may be the deeper reason this subject holds attention. A straw mattress is small enough to understand. We can imagine lying on it. We can hear the rustle. We can feel the uneven pressure. We can picture the dim room, the smoke-darkened beams, the child turning beside a tired parent, the cold floor below, the smell of old straw and wool, the first pale light of morning. But once we understand that small thing, it opens into something much larger. The structure of work, poverty, gender, health, class, housing, agriculture, domestic labor, and the slow rise of modern expectations. A bed is never just a bed. It is a meeting point between a society's resources and a person's most basic vulnerability. Everyone must sleep. Kings, farmers, servants, soldiers, children, prisoners, travelers, the sick, the poor, and the old all become defenseless in the dark. The difference is what lies beneath them, who prepared it, who paid for it, who cleaned it, who judged it sufficient, and whether they had any power to demand better. Straw makes those differences visible because it belongs so often to the people with the least power to change their nights. Over time, as straw retreated from ordinary domestic beds in many places, it left behind a kind of memory of roughness. It became associated with barns, poverty, old cottages, emergency shelters, military improvisation, and the hard lives of people before modern comfort. In some memories, it was softened into nostalgia. The sweet smell of fresh straw, the warmth of a loft, the simplicity of rural life. In others, it remained a mark of deprivation. Scratchy, dirty, cold, and shared because there was no alternative. Both memories can be true, depending on the night, the person, and whether the straw was chosen or endured. That distinction is perhaps the most important one. A temporary night on fresh straw after a harvest feast, a journey, or a summer adventure could become a pleasant story. A lifetime of sleeping on old straw because poverty allowed nothing else was a different matter entirely. History often uses the same object to hold many meanings. Straw could be comfort, humiliation, practicality, neglect, humility, resourcefulness, or poverty. The object itself was simple. The life around it was not. So when we imagine someone sleeping on straw night after night, we should resist the easy picture. It was not always misery, and it was not charming simplicity. It was a material compromise inside a world of limits. Fresh straw could be welcome. Old straw could be punishing. A shared bed could be warm. A shared bed could be suffocating. A humble mattress could be a treasured possession. The same mattress in an institution could be a sign of how little someone's comfort mattered. The truth lies in the conditions around it. The final image, then, should not be only a poor person lying in discomfort. It should be the whole room, the fading fire, the patch ticking, the roof that may or may not keep out rain, the mother arranging children where warmth can be shared, the servant returning to a corner after making someone else's bed, the laborer lowering a sore body onto a surface that will not fully restore it, the old person lying too long on flattened straw, the traveler listening for insects in an inn, the reformer later writing down what they saw, sometimes with compassion, sometimes with judgment. The bed holds all of them, and beyond the room, the field remains present. The grain has been cut. The useful seed has been saved for food. The stalks have been gathered, dried, stored, and carried indoors. The harvest enters the mattress. The year enters the body. Autumn freshness becomes winter flattening, spring damp, summer insects, and then, if the household is fortunate, renewal again. To sleep on straw was to sleep inside the agricultural calendar, even when the bed was in a town far from the field. It was to rest on the leftover structure of survival. Modern comfort has made that connection harder to feel. A mattress today often arrives wrapped, labeled, purchased, delivered, and placed in a room designed for sleep. Its materials may be distant, industrial, and invisible. The person lying on it may not think of fields, harvests, barns, servants, washing days, patch ticking, or the cost of a blanket before winter. But the older bed reminds us that comfort has a history. Clean sleep, private sleep, soft sleep, and dependable sleep were not always ordinary. They had to be created. And once created, they had to be defended. Because whenever people are pushed into poverty, displacement, overcrowding, war, or institutional neglect, sleep becomes rough again. The surface beneath the body changes first. Privacy disappears. Clean bedding becomes scarce. Warmth becomes uncertain. The old question returns in a modern form: what is the minimum a human body can be given? And what happens when that minimum is treated as enough? That is why the history of sleeping on straw is not only about the past. It gives us a way to understand how deeply material comfort shapes human dignity. It shows us that civilization is not measured only by monuments, inventions, armies, or great political events. It is also measured by the hidden arrangements of ordinary nights. Who sleeps dry? Who sleeps warm? Who sleeps crowded? Who wakes bitten, stiff, ashamed, or unrest? Who gets to call a bed their own? For the people who slept on straw night after night, the answer was rarely simple. Many accepted it, many improved it, many endured it, and many likely longed for something better without leaving written evidence behind. Their lives remain mostly quiet in the archives, but their bedding tells us something. It tells us that history was lived not only in public squares and battlefields, but on rough mattresses in dark rooms, where tired bodies tried to recover enough strength to meet another day. And perhaps that is the most honest way to leave them. Not as symbols of quaint rural life, and not only as victims of hardship, but as people who made rest out of what they had. They gathered the remains of the harvest, stuffed them into cloth, laid them over wood or rope or floor, pulled blankets close, shared warmth, fought insects, endured cold, and rose again. Night after night, the straw beneath them carried the quiet weight of ordinary survival. So if one detail from this history stays with you, let it be that rest itself was once a form of labor. It had to be prepared, maintained, negotiated, and sometimes simply endured. A bed was not guaranteed comfort. It was a fragile arrangement between material, whether money, work, and care. And for countless people, straw was the material that stood between the body and the ground. If this kind of quiet, everyday history interests you, you're welcome to share what detail surprised you most, or what ordinary part of the past you'd like explored next. And if you'd like to return for more calm, thoughtful history told slowly and carefully, subscribing is a simple way to find the next documentary when it arrives. Thank you for spending this time here, and for looking closely at a part of the past that was humble, uncomfortable, and deeply human.